George Monbiot, writing in The Guardian, says that neoliberalism is the ideology that dominates our lives. And I think that's true enough, and we could all agree. Um, but he goes on to say that for most of us, it has no name. Even if your listeners have heard the term before, they will struggle to define it. Neoliberalism, do you know what it is? Now, we on the left use the term more often than the general public, but I think his point stands. Given how all-encompassing neoliberalism is, it's often poorly understood, even by people who discuss and critique it. Um, to illustrate this confusion, let's look at a couple of examples from the discourse during the Trump administration. First, this absolutely incoherent commentary from New York Magazine's Jonathan Chait, a very influential establishment shill who, among other lowlights, led the cheers among liberals for the invasion of Iraq. Here he is saying that neoliberal doesn't mean a faction of liberals. It now refers to liberals generally and is applied by their left-wing critics. Neoliberalism is held to be the source of all ills suffered by the Democratic Party and progressive politics for over 4 decades. Now, these definitions could not be more wrong, and I'm not sure if this dithering is deliberately clouding the issue so he can deny that neoliberalism even exists, or if he's just stupid. I'm not sure of that, but who knows? But then you get misconceptions from people who should know better. Look at this from Cornel West in an interview with Jacobin entitled "Bernie was crushed by neoliberalism." And again, so here, the neoliberal wing of the ruling class, as he puts it, versus the neo-fascist wing of the ruling class. The prefix neo doing a lot of work here, suggesting that neoliberalism springs out of political liberalism, which is just not true. And again here, nihilism is not just on the right, it's among neoliberals as well. So counterposing neoliberalism with the right wing, which is just off base. It's amusingly off base. And here's that misconception in graphic form. This is an update on the horseshoe theory, which, in case you don't know, is the dumb centrist idea that the further left you go, the closer you get to the right. Normally, communism is on the left tip of the horseshoe. Well, this one has neoliberalism, and this update is nearly as dumb as the original. Again, the idea that it's coming out of political liberalism. So neoliberalism is something that is vaguely defined in all kinds of places, left, right, and center, clearly. But we are Marxists and we don't want to be vague. So in one of our readings, Neil Davidson responds to an economist who says, there is no such thing as neoliberalism and you don't have a clue how to define it. So it's kind of clouding the issue the same way Chait did. Davidson's response is, actually there is, and I can. Okay. Now, we are doing something that Marxists should do more often when they want clarity on different stages of capitalism, and that is turn to Neil Davidson. Davidson was a Scottish Marxist, historian, and activist. He was a longtime member of the SWP in Britain and then left after the rape cover-up scandal of 2013 and helped to found RS21. He died in 2020 of a brain tumor at the tragically young age of 62. His most well-known work is How Revolutionary Were the Bourgeois Revolutions, a book that's been pretty important to my development as a Marxist, such as it is. That book is all about the history of the development of capitalism from the 1600s all the way to the 20th century. I probably need to read it again because it's both dense and nuanced, and I don't think I could speak on it at length, even having read it. Kind of a side note, it'd probably be a good one for a reading group just so we could all drill into it together. But still, this book gave me so much insight into the development of the capitalist class and the capitalist state. Like, basically, Davidson wrote the book on the development of the capitalist state. One thing it really made clear to me is the idea of capitalism as this totalizing system that imposes its logic everywhere. This is why capitalism behaves so similarly across borders and why we can't have socialism in one country. You know, that really, obviously, those things befuddle liberals, they befuddle Stalinists, but they're very important in terms of how we organize against capitalism. Now, the reason I paused to mention this book by Davidson is that his theorizing of the history of capitalism really comes into play in his analysis of neoliberalism. It gave me a lot of context having already read this book. According to Davidson, the term neoliberalism means three different things depending on the context. Number one, it's a school of thought, which emerged in Europe in the 1930s in opposition to the state planning that became widespread policy amidst the Great Depression. It was coined at a 1938 meeting in Paris, whose delegates included Ludwig Mises and Friedrich Hayek, and those are these guys here. Eventually, their philosophy was taken up at the universities of Chicago and Virginia. And after that, the most famous proponent from the 1950s on was Milton Friedman, who taught at the U of Chicago, and he was a highly influential neoclassical American economist who led the ideological opposition to Keynesianism, which, to put it simply, is the economic theory that justifies social spending by governments. And that was the dominant economic model in the West from the Great Depression until the 70s. And by the way, these early proponents of neoliberalism felt they were opposing quote unquote socialism. So they weren't the first and they weren't the last to get a little bit of state planning and welfare mixed up with socialism. Now, we're not going to spend too long on this theoretical school because, as Davidson argues, neoliberalism would have come about anyway in the 70s, whether or not it had already been theorized, because it was a capitalist response to economic crisis that had its own organic momentum. So in other words, it wasn't that leaders were like, oh, I've just read this great thing by Hayek, I'm going to institute neoliberalism. No, it was much more organic than that. And Davidson says all of this would have happened if those guys hadn't written one word. But the school of thought did exist to justify it in the minds of them, those who began instituting neoliberalism, especially in Chile, where many of the economists in charge of the new policies had been educated under Friedman in Chicago. They were part of an exchange program sponsored by the US government with the aim of, quote unquote, resisting Marxist influences in economic and political institutions. And these Chilean economists became known as the Chicago Boys. And yeah, I do want to point out that Friedman and the others weren't just harmless intellectuals. They were ideologues who helped justify some awful things, namely Chilean fascism, which has been called the laboratory of neoliberalism. Friedman visited with Pinochet in 1975. You can see him here. And he referred to the economic changes there as the miracle of Chile. Miracle of Chile. Meanwhile, one of the founders of the neoliberal school of thought, Hayek, said upon a visit to Chile, my personal preference leans toward a liberal dictatorship rather than toward a democratic government devoid of liberalism. That quote, not only is it just absolutely bloodthirsty and awful, but it also clarifies the meaning of the liberal in neoliberalism. It's not political liberalism, it's liberalism for the capitalist class. It's freedom for the capitalist class. So just to make the point that these guys were real bastards and fuck them. Now, the second thing, the number 2 definition of neoliberalism, according to Davidson, is this strategy that we've been referring to. Between World War II and the 60s, there was an unprecedented economic growth worldwide. And there was also a post-war consensus in the West for policies like full employment, poverty relief, taxing the rich, public services, and safety nets. Wages were higher, unions were stronger, and social welfare was more available, broadly speaking. The rise of neoliberalism started in the wake of the economic crisis of 1973. It was the end of the period of growth, and most of all, it was the decline in the rate of profit. And that set in motion, of course, you touch capitalist profits, they're going to panic, and that set in motion their reaction. Davidson says neoliberalism was the strategy adopted by the alliance of state managers, politicians, and employers, which began to emerge from the mid to late 70s, first in Chile, also in the UK and USA. This responded to the return of economic crisis in 1973 by seeking to shift the balance of power in the workplace from labor to capital. And they did this by weakening unions through artificially increasing unemployment and by attacking workers in key sectors. They attacked miners in the UK and air traffic controllers in the US. And they also relocated industry to regions with low union numbers, such as the South. And by the way, that's Thatcher meeting with Pinochet. Ruling classes had a limited set of options, according to Davidson. It's therefore unsurprising that most arrived at the same set of responses: privatization, outsourcing, deregulation, unrestricted capital flows, indirect rather than direct taxation, and all the rest. So just to underscore the point that it wasn't some thing that was invented in an office somewhere. It was a systemic thing that started happening based on a lot of systemic factors. Number 3 definition, according to Davidson, is just the era of capitalism in which we live. The entire history of capitalism since this strategy was implemented in most capitalist states. Neoliberalism is often presented as capitalism behaving unnaturally or as some weird cancerous growth on capitalism. You'll especially find that kind of narrative coming from liberals and social democrats, and even the ones who have the broader definition correct. But neoliberalism is capitalism responding to crisis and changing conditions. It's just a different stage of capitalism, and we have to analyze it that way. It's not like it changes from one administration to another, as those bad definitions would lead you to believe. Contrary to what Cornel West thinks, if Bernie Sanders had been elected president, he would be presiding over neoliberalism just as much as Biden is now. Chile in the 1970s is integral to understanding neoliberalism. It can be instituted under fascism, as it was there. It can be instituted in a prosperous democracy under center-left leadership, as was the case here in Australia in the 80s and 90s under Labour governments. It can and does function in China. And this is really clarifying to realize that China is a neoliberal economy, but have fun explaining that to campuses. Mike Gonzalez's summary of Chilean neoliberalism in Revolutionary Rehearsals is like an epitaph for this entire era around the world. He says the Pinochet regime turned Chile into an experimental arena for a monetarist economics unimpeded by an organized working class. Their logic was a logic of capitalism with its gloves off. A minimum standard of living for workers, permanent and structural unemployment, a complete absence of social services, a climate of permanent terror, schools where only jingoism and resignation could be taught. According to Patrick Eiber in the New Republic in Chile, by 1978, all but 7 of the hundreds of companies in state hands in 73 had been reprivatized. But the deepest neoliberal phase began in 1979 with reforms that reduced the power of unions, decentralized the school system, and replaced pensions with individual retirement accounts. So, hearing all that, it probably won't come as a surprise that Chile was a massive influence on Republicans, but sticking with the theme of the whole talk, there was also an influence on Democrats. According to Eiber, after the dictatorship ended in 1991 and the center-left coalition took power, neoliberalism remained. They restored labor rights and introduced some new social programs. Still, they retained the market economy, openness to trade, and low tax rates, which for some on the left was a bitter pill. A competitive and consumerist culture would remain. There would be no return to an economy based in solidarity. And really clarifying point that the dictatorship ended, fascism in Chile ended, but neoliberalism remains. So that tells you something about neoliberalism. And that happened in 1991, and it would be like 27 long years before the uprising in 2018 that challenged all this finally, Reagan and Thatcher are often cited as the arch villains of neoliberalism, but in fact, it was Jimmy Carter in the US and in UK, Labour Prime Minister Jim Callaghan, who pioneered some neoliberal economic policies around the same time as Chile. And these were centered on fighting inflation by reducing government spending. But as is typical, the Democrats do the setup, and Republicans really kick the football hard, don't they? Monbiot says, after Thatcher and Reagan took power, the rest of the package soon followed. Massive tax cuts for the rich, the crushing of trade unions, deregulation, privatization, outsourcing, and competition in public services. Through the IMF, the World Bank, and the World Trade Organization, neoliberal policies were imposed, often without democratic consent, on much of the world. Davidson points out that other eras of capitalism ended in crisis, like the way 1929 was an end of an era. And then, as we said, the period of mid-century reform ended in 1973. But neoliberalism survived its crisis in 2007, the global financial crash, and is more entrenched now, even as it becomes more destructive. Monbiot calls it a zombie doctrine that keeps lurching on after all its failures. Some characteristics of neoliberalism. Davidson says, neoliberalism is an attempt to create a world in which all human relationships are forced to conform to a model of economic competition. He says that Hayek argued that for most of human history, we sought cooperation rather than competition, and that this attitude had to be stamped out of us if capitalism was ever to be truly secure. So Hayek was right about the cooperation in most of human history, but just so evil and wrong about this second thing. Monbiot calls it freedom for the big fish, not the little fish. Freedom from trade unions and collective bargaining means the freedom to suppress wages. Freedom from regulation means the freedom to poison rivers, endanger workers, charge iniquitous interest, and design exotic financial instruments. Freedom from tax means freedom from the distribution of wealth. Did I get this mixed up? There. narrow economic parameters and identity-based politics. That's one characteristic. We're talking about some characteristics here. Davidson says neoliberal politics have increasingly narrow parameters where choice is restricted to social rather than economic issues. So in other words, the rulers, whether on the center left or center right, agree on neoliberal economy in terms of how to run capitalism, but they disagree about social things, like, for instance, gay rights. And we, as the electorate, are basically stuck with this much narrowed conception of politics. Yeah. Some factors that led to this: the breaking up of the social movements of the 60s, the disorientation of Stalinism, and then the collapse of the Soviet Union. All this gave the broad impression that there was no leftist answer to the onslaughts against the working class. Red Flags Ben Hillier wrote that as the radical wave ebbed in the 70s, the left moved toward political pluralism and identity politics as the workers' movement was put on the defensive. Deregulation and privatization. Another characteristic. The privatization or marketization of public services such as energy, water, trains, health, education, and roads has enabled corporations to set up toll booths in front of essential assets and charge rent. By the way, this is Monbiot in the Guardian who wrote this. Set up toll booths, and privatization allows corporations to set up toll booths in front of essential assets and charge rent, either to citizens or to government for their use. Rent is another term for unearned income. And I just think that thinking of it as rent is such a clarifying way to look at privatization. You're just paying more because you're paying rent. It's not because the services are better. In fact, they're usually worse. Financialization. The rich increase their control over money, especially via interest payments. These days, we are loaded with debt thanks to the withdrawal of state funding. Think about the difference between a student grant and a student loan. Another characteristic: universal competition and obsession with statistics. Monbiot says neoliberalism sees competition as the defining characteristic of human relations. Workers, job seekers, and public services of every kind are subject to a pettifogging, stifling regime of assessment and monitoring designed to identify winners and punish losers, and bureaucracy proliferates. And I included this shot from Moneyball and this meme that's made out of it because Moneyball is just the epitome of this. It's like within a sports context, being, these extremely detailed statistics that are used to punish workers and lower their wages. And I'm actually, as a baseball fan, I'm ashamed that I ever thought this was cool, because this ideology actually spread from the baseball world into the corporate world, and it's used now in terms of all sorts of things like worker surveillance and so on. And I just think it's so hilarious that this meme is supposed to be all wholesome and it's actually so awful what it's saying. Disaster capitalism. Let's see, where are we? Yeah. Disaster capitalism, taking advantage of the void created by disasters to impose neoliberal policies. We saw it in New Orleans after Katrina. Public schools were closed there in record numbers and replaced by charter schools. And in Haiti in 2011 after the earthquake there, and in Iraq after the US invasion. And just want to point out that some of these disasters are natural, but some of them are created by neoliberal governments, like in Iraq, invade and destroy the country, or neoliberal policies that wreck public services, and then corporations leap in there as the logical thing to solve the problem. Globalization, offshoring of jobs, NAFTA and other trade treaties that make a mockery of state regulation and workers' rights and enshrine corporations as individuals. And with the result being like the maquiladoras, the giant factories on the Mexican border, where U.S. companies operate with dramatically lower wages and what are basically old-fashioned company towns. And these places are rife with union busting and sexual harassment, among other ills. Okay, neoliberal ideology and culture. In a word, it's highly individualist. I probably don't have to, explain it to any of us in this room. We all feel it. Just think of hustle porn, the grind set, influencer culture, this extremely individualist culture where you take on all of these things that are happening in society onto yourself. In 1987, Margaret Thatcher famously said, "They are casting their problems at society." And there is no such thing as society. There are individual men and women, and there are families. And no government can do anything through people, and people must look after themselves first. there's probably no better distillation of neoliberal ideology, at least in terms of how it's sold to us, right? As we'll get to, uh, these people uh, these people very much do want the state and rely on the state, but this is what they try to tell us. And I just thought that George Costanza was the best response to this bullshit. Ben Hillier wrote in Red Flag, neoliberalism seeks to break the bonds of social solidarity and create a culture and economy in which every human is an entrepreneur manager of their own lives. Human relationships take on the form of buyer-seller exchanges in which everything and everyone is debased and reduced to a market valuation. What is unmarketable is worthless, according to this philosophy. And all these things have social consequences. It's had a massive impact on mental health. In recent years, there have been epidemics of self-harm, eating disorders, depression, anxiety, and social phobia. Research shows that people today, especially young people, have fewer friends, fewer relations with neighbors or community organizations. And I used to think it was just me that had fewer friends because I'm getting older or because I'm autistic, but it's happening to a lot of us. Hillier says, powerlessness, uncertainty, and displacement are permanent features of society under neoliberalism. Okay, neoliberalism and the state. Davidson says that it's a paradox, that neoliberalism is relatively successful as a strategy for the ruling class, particularly crushing unions and reducing profits that go to labor, but it's, at the same time, some things about it are detrimental to the system overall. There's a kind of built-in instability. This is an important point. Davidson says you would have to be naive to believe that the neoliberal project is mainly about free markets, although this myth has been perpetrated by social democratic parties who are eager to disguise their capitulation to it. But neoliberalism isn't uniquely destructive either. Davidson insists that capitalism was always capable of producing social atomization, collective violence, and environmental destruction, even in periods when the state was far more directly involved. And he also says that neoliberals were never really opposed to the state, despite common conceptions. They're not really looking for some kind of libertarian absolute freedom. They've always needed the state to bring their desired order into being in the first place and to enforce and legitimize it. The notion that neoliberalism is about markets as opposed to the state, it is simply a myth. It is rather about changing what the state does. So to understand what has changed about the capitalist state under neoliberalism, we need to understand what the capitalist state is and what it's supposed to do in the first place. There are two foundational aspects of capitalism, according to Davidson. Now, I'm going to try to condense this, and I'm pretty sure he just lifted this straight from his book into this article because it felt very familiar, and it's kind of the same point, and it's kind of like the core of what the capitalist state is. There's a horizontal competition between capitals and a vertical conflict between labor and capital, and what the capitalist state does is it mediates those horizontal and vertical things. Okay, so it imposes a dual social order. The horizontal social order over competing capitals so that market relations do not collapse into the war of all against all. And it imposes an order over the conflict between labor and capital so that it continues to be resolved always in the interest of capital. Okay. Beyond this, states also have to establish general conditions of production, which is just basically technical infrastructure and welfare that capitalists wouldn't do themselves to maintain the system. And these functions are mainly internal within nations, within nation states, but states also mediate internationally, or they may also wage war internationally. So they represent the capitalists internally and externally. Davidson talks about how both Adam Smith and Marx recognized capitalists' inability to regulate themselves, thus the need for the state, because the capitalist state is inept and short-sighted compared to previous ruling classes in history, like feudal lords, combined political and economic leadership, but capitalists can only do the political, to do the economic. They can't do both. They're inept compared to them. The state is what keeps capitalism from destroying itself. Example cited by Davidson is what Marx learned from studying the British Factory Acts, which limited the length of the workday. These kinds of reforms are allowed by capitalists because they make capitalism less destructive and more efficient in exploiting workers. Fewer workers ground up in the machines, fewer 12-year-olds dying in mining accidents, and this is to the benefit of the system because workers live longer and can be exploited more. So an example of reform making the system efficient. Okay, not every action is carried out. Not every action carried out by the state is in the direct interest of capitalists, but must ultimately be subordinated to their interests. The reforms only go so far. And all of this creates tension. Capitalists know they need the state for these reasons, but there's always a constant underlying fear that state managers will one day restrict or abolish their right to private property. And Salvador Allende found out what happens when you try that, or at least when you try it when you don't have a revolution, proper revolution. So Davidson calls neoliberalism the agent of capitalist self-destruction. He says, so the capitalist state really hasn't changed. It still needs to perform the core functions. There's no such thing as a neoliberal state, quote unquote, as such. The difference under neoliberalism is that now the state is no longer mediating quite the same way it used to. It's not mediating between capitals or between capital and workers in quite the same way it used to. And here's the money quote from Davidson. What has changed is that the relationship between neoliberal regimes and capital since the 70s has prevented states from acting effectively in the collective long-term interest of capitalism. Davidson calls this short-termism. Increasingly, the state adopts the logic of financial capital with regard to planning for the future and the environment, et cetera. The environment, et cetera. In other words, there's not very much planning, or there's no planning. So there's three factors in this shift in how the state operates now. This is a pretty brilliant section by Davidson because it paints such a detailed picture of how all these mechanisms work. I'm going to try to summarize it instead of just reading it. So what happens is that the political wing of state managers are depoliticized. Their power is delegated away towards supposedly neutral bodies. Like in the UK, the power to set interest rates is transferred from the Treasury to an unelected committee of the Bank of England. The more power they delegate away, the more they are just a professional caste who are increasingly remote from reality. They're more remote from the people. They've never met the people who suffer under their policies, but at the same time, they're more committed to capitalist ideas of what's best for the state. And politics in this sense just becomes more meaningless. It's like a shadow play, just an empty ritual with only superficial differences in the players. It gives the impression of something happening, but nothing concrete really happens within parliaments or congresses, right? Conversely, the politicization of the non-political wing of state managers, the civil servants, these ones become politicized. The politicians are depoliticized, they're politicized. Basically, they're tailing the politicians. They're brought more into line with political parties. The expectation is that they won't argue with the politicians or come up with alternative ways of delivering policy. They won't act independently. They simply present arguments to justify political policy. We see this with, for example, how the CDC and the NIH have politicized the COVID pandemic, tailing the Biden administration instead of providing the medical and scientific leadership they could and should. Okay, and then the third way this works, the third mechanism is depolitization of the electorate. This is something we all know. With so little difference, so little happening in the halls of power, voters abstain, and they abstain in growing numbers. They no longer have anything to really vote for, and the ones who are still involved in casting their vote are doing it on a consumer model of it's, a politician might be like a lifestyle brand for them. Okay, but even those ones who are invested on this really shallow consumerist level are declining. Okay. Davidson cites California as an early center of neoliberalism, where propositions on the ballot basically allow the middle classes to hijack the whole system and prevent reforms such as taxing property. Okay, this is individualism as government policy. This kind of mobilized, really conservative middle class, actually causes a financial crisis in California in 2009. Because the state just can't raise any more taxes, and this leads into like this feedback loop where this justifies more neoliberal policies. It justifies more austerity. They can't raise taxes, so they start cutting public services. And this is Davidson has this kind of devastating bit that outlines the scope and the intractability of the problem. Basically the entire neoliberal project is premised on the irreversibility of this process, the abolition of regulatory mechanisms, dismantling of welfare, ratification of treaties for which there are no ways to amend or annul them, and then the logic just becomes, I'm sorry, we can't fix this, we can't go back. It's like a ratchet, we've abolished all these things, we've changed all these things, and there's no more political will left to do anything. And of course, we can see this in like the Biden administration in the way, they promise all this build back better, but they don't do anything because and they just keep saying, oh well, we can't, and the ultimate effect of this is that it allows the far right to surge and influence, right? Because this kind of political homogeneity and stalemate, uh, allows the far right to present itself as an alternative to these crises that neoliberalism sets up but offers no solution to, especially after the GFC. The far right seems to offer solutions that are lacking. It positions itself as outside the consensus and speaks to popular appetites for destruction fostered by capitalism itself, in Davidson's words. And I think a glaring example of this is the derailed train and the chemical spill in Ohio. This is kind of like you see all these things in play, right? A crisis caused by crumbling infrastructure, no government or agency with the will to take control of it, decades of attacks on unions and wages. It's the whole picture. And Biden and the Democrats could only throw up their hands and say they were doing everything they could, which everyone can plainly see as nothing. And here comes Trump to hand out MAGA hats and say he's going to help, which of course he isn't, but you can see why it works, And Davidson makes the interesting point that for a certain layer, the far right seems to be the only viable form of collectivism left, especially in the context of no more alternative to capitalism after 1991, even though the Soviet Union was a false alternative, right? So this false idea of the end of history has political consequences in stoking the right wing and the hopelessness of the electorate. They especially take this out on immigrants, of course. The workers cast out into the void by these policies worldwide. And Davidson talks about how the far right influences policy in a destructive way, because the center-right parties depend on the far right for votes, and they appeal to them with things like anti-abortion measures and anti-immigrant measures, which can have a destructive effect on the system. And the example he cites is HB 56, the 2011 Act in Alabama, which forced immigrants to carry papers they couldn't receive social services. The result was actually a mass exodus of immigrants from the state, from immigrant workers from the state, that significantly impacted the agricultural industry and drastically lowered state GDP and tax income. So Davidson makes the point that it's self-destructive, but they will keep doing this because that's their logic. That's the way that the center-right parties can see how to function anymore. And this same dynamic of self-destruction played out on a much larger scale with Brexit, okay, which I think happened after Davidson wrote this. And this is how all this can lead to fascism. Skip something. The defense of the system is always the principal objective of the bourgeoisie, even at the expense of temporary system malfunction. In a situation where economic desperation is leading to mounting disorder, far-right parties would be brought into play to direct attention from the real source of social anguish onto already identified scapegoats, no matter what price they exacted in terms of policy. Coming to the conclusion here, what Davidson is not saying, he's not saying socialists should propose solutions to all this. That's reformism, okay? And the second thing he's not saying that the collapse of capitalism under the weight of all these contradictions is inevitable, okay? It could get worse. It could get more barbaric. The condition of Central Africa, as he writes, and parts of the Middle East today indicate the presence of actually existing barbarism as the daily reality for millions. Events in the developed world are unlikely to take this form, at least until environmental catastrophe becomes irreversible. And I think when he wrote this in 2015, even back then, scientists didn't realize it was going to be accelerating this fast. But he says rather that will involve a gradual and for the very poorest, imperceptible worsening and coarsening in our conditions of life. I don't think it's necessarily imperceptible anymore. So we're reaching a stage of neoliberalism where there are no longer very many controls on the worst effects of capitalism, and creative destruction has no more limits or boundaries. And because Davidson is a Marxist and a revolutionary, he ends on a call to action. Revolution is all that stands in the way of the disaster that otherwise awaits.